The character action genre is in a bit of a weird state. It's a subgenre of hack and slash games, which are a subgenre of action games, while also being an evolution of another subgenre. It has a few different names for the genre. There's character action, stylish action, spectacle fighter, extreme action, and I've even heard of crazy games. For the purpose of this video, I'll be sticking to character action to name the genre. It's games often mistaken at a glance as hack and slash games or games that are solely developed by Platinum Games. But what people don't see are the little subtleties that change the games in big ways compared to your standard action game. So with that in mind, I'd like to clear up the misconceptions that people may have, and to clearly answer the question, what is the character action genre? The internet defines the character action genre as 3D action games where the main focus is on the combat and free-forming combos. Rather than forcing the player to memorize extensive repetitive combos and techniques, character action games present the player with a number of open-ended combat tools capable of leading into each other, giving the player freedom. This allows skilled players to create inventive action sequences in standard combat. Players are given increasing movesets and more weapons can be obtained the further they progress. And before going any further, I'd like to give some history on the genre. Character action games are said to be an evolution of the beat-em-up genre. To give a brief overview, beat-em-ups are side-scrolling games where the player is tasked with beating enemies periodically in order to progress through a mostly linear stage. These games started off with characters having very limited movesets with no variation between them, and as time went on, the concepts in those games were expanded upon. Players were given more options to work with, and different characters eventually got moves that were unique to those characters. They added more mechanics like special moves, juggling, and even canceling moves. When games started moving towards a 3D space, there was a sort of split in the beat-em-up genre. They became the character action genre, and the 3D beat-em-up / brawler genre. I do feel like there's some differences between the two genres, but that's a discussion for another video. While the Devil May Cry series, or more specifically Devil May Cry, released in 2001, is known to be the first game in the character action genre, there's another game worth mentioning that came before. It can be seen as a sort of prototype for the character action genre. Rising Zan, the Samurai Gunman, is a game that was released in 1999 for the PS1. While it doesn't have everything needed for it to be a character action game, some of the ideas there are seen in Devil May Cry and future games of the genre. Certain moves are similar, the combo structure, and giving the player some freedom when it comes to comboing enemies. Some of these ideas are taken and expanded upon in later games of the genre, but going back to Devil May Cry, as stated previously, a lot of the moves and combo structure are similar to Rising Zan. When implemented into DMC, they were refined, and Dante was given more weapons to his arsenal than just a sword and a pistol. These additions and more give the player more options to play around with when fighting enemies. And nearly every character action game after it has either added or refined the mechanics more and more. And while we're on the subject of DMC's history, as far as I know, the team didn't originally set out to make a game similar to Rising Zan. It originally started development as Resident Evil 4 under Hideki Kamiya, the director of the first Devil May Cry game. However, in its prototype stages, it proved to be a radical departure from the established Resident Evil formula and the survival horror genre in general. Rather than abandon the project entirely, the premise was changed and eventually became the first Devil May Cry. Now then, there are a few other characterizations that are staples to the genre, and some of these will be implemented better than others, and how well it's implemented can be a good indication of the quality of the game itself. One such characterization is the scoring system and how a player's abilities are graded overall. Things like damage taken, the amount of time taken to beat a fight, or level, and in some games if certain items were used to help out a player. Even on a smaller scale for an individual fight, there's a combo meter. In some games, the combo meter is only a way to keep track of an uninterrupted string of attacks on enemies and how much damage is done to them. But in others, like Devil May Cry, the combo meter continues to rise only if the player is able to come up with creative and varied combos that don't use the same few moves from the same weapon. So if the only attacks you're doing are, say, light attacks from the sword, the combo meter isn't going to go up too high. And most character action games, if not all of them, tend to have various defensive options like dodging, blocking, counters, and parrying. And most character action games will at least have one defensive option for a player to use. And I'll give a quick rundown of the differences between them. Blocking stops incoming attacks for minimal or no damage. Dodging is when a player invades incoming attacks by either rolling or something similar. When done correctly, the character will take no damage, and games like Bayonetta even use the dodging in an offensive way. If timed correctly, Bayonetta will go into Witch Time, which slows down any enemies in the combat arena, allowing her to counterattack. And speaking of counterattacks, counters let the player hit the enemy right before the enemy's attack hits the player. Counters tend to be powerful hits that knock the enemy away, and in some cases into the air. The timing is a lot stricter than blocking or dodging, but you are able to deal heavy damage to the enemy. And finally, there's parrying, which is when you deflect an enemy's incoming attack, leaving them open to a counterattack. It doesn't result in any damage being taken, although the timing is as strict, if not stricter, than a counter. But the payout is usually more rewarding for the player because it gives them an opportunity to start a combo instead of just dealing heavy damage to the enemy. And defensive options have more uses than just shielding a player from incoming attacks. They can be used to cancel moves, and canceling is when the animation for a move is interrupted by the start of another move. It's one of the things that gives players creative control of combos. And an important but bit of a weird characterization of the genre is that they tend to have breaks in the action gameplay with other genres. It gives the player a breather and keeps them from doing nothing but action. It can also serve as a transition between stages. The really interesting thing about the genre switching found in character action games is that there's no set genre that it changes to. It simply has to fit the setting of the game or be able to transition smoothly. For example, Devil May Cry has platforming and puzzle solving. Metal Gear Rising has segments where you can use stealth. The Legend of Korra has an endless runner style segment. And one of the more common genre switches are shmups or shoot 'em ups. And it's used pretty often in Marlo Briggs and the Mask of Death, whereas in some other games like Bayonetta it's only used once or twice, but that game also tends to have other genre switches. And NieR Automata has one of the most genre switching I've seen in a good while. It has hacking segments, shmup segments, and even text adventure segments. The most impressive thing is that all the genre switches feel thematically appropriate in that game. As you can see, the character action genre is more than just a basic definition of it. It's certainly the most important part of it, but all of the different parts come together to give the games in the genre a specific feeling. And these games generally have a fair skill floor for beginners on the easier difficulties. Even at the higher difficulties, the technical skill required in some games is not the skill ceiling. The skill ceiling can be extremely high in these games, but that's a lot of the appeal to them. The satisfaction of being able to pull off combos and seeing yourself improve is great. There's almost always something new to learn or work on. The limit lies in how much work the player is willing to put in. Along with that, the smoothness and how fluid the combat is are also appeals of the genre. To compare this to a similar but different action genre, the Musou genre, which consists mainly of games in the Dynasty Warrior series, is all about giving power to the player and making them feel invincible. Players fight large swaths of enemies with attacks that have large hitboxes to hit most of the enemies on screen. You'll rarely get hit and won't have to try new combos because most of the enemies are basic enemies and they're lethargic and in high numbers. Whereas in character action games, it's more about having the player effectively deal with a handful of enemies, and that can include multiples of higher tier enemies. It's not the only difference, but I feel like it's one of the main differences between the genres. To make another comparison, one that's maybe easier to find the distinctions between them, the Batman Arkham series by Rocksteady Games. In the Batman Arkham series, the player only really has one button that is their main method of attack. Other attacks are either combinations of buttons or done by hitting the attack button after hitting a non-attack button. All the characters have the same moves, with the exceptions being their weapons and special takedowns, but even some of those can be similar to other characters. Devil May Cry has extremely varied moves and move lists from character to character, and even with the control scheme being somewhat similar, the difference in the attacks and their properties can be pretty drastic. In the Batman Arkham series, once reaching a certain number in their combo, the player has the ability to zip back and forth to other enemies that can be far away from the character. But in the Devil May Cry series and other character action games, players are expected to find their own way to enemies further away, but are given ways to aid the player. This can be either movement options, attacks to bring the enemy close, or ranged attacks to stall the enemy till the player closes in. On the note of Batman's combo meter, it's mostly used as a way to keep track of how many times you've hit enemies without being hit yourself. But in a good amount of character action games, it's more of a style meter and increases depending on how stylish or technical the combo is. As a final note, if you combine the fluid, flashy, and strong gameplay with the admittedly cheesy but fun stories, and the genre switches for breaks in gameplay, you'll get the answer to the question, what is the character action genre? Well, that's gonna be it for me, but before I go, I'd like to leave you guys with some questions. I know that the term character action is more of a colloquial term. What term do you usually use to refer to the character action genre? Spectacle fighter, stylish action, extreme action, crazy games, or something else? What's your favorite character action game? And lastly, is there anything you feel I missed or didn't talk about enough? Let me know in the comments below, and please remember to be respectful of one another. See you later.